We're speaking today with Siobhan McHugh. Siobhan is an Honorary Associate Professor with the Media and Communications discipline at Macquarie University, and she's had a distinguished career as an academic and as an oral historian and a podcaster. Siobhan, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Great to be here.
Siobhan, I mentioned your expansive career, and it's really hard to know how to best recap a career such as yours, but I thought I'd start by asking what it was that first hooked you about spoken word audio.
Well, I was lucky enough to be plucked from about 2,000 people and taken as a cadet with the Irish public broadcaster back when I was about 23 or something. And we had to make a documentary at the end of this month-long course. And I was always a bit perverse in that I went for the opposite of what everybody else was doing. And I wanted to interview immigrants to Ireland. And at the time, there were very few. This was miles before the Celtic Tiger. So I went, and Ireland was a very homogenous seeming place, but I went looking for Africans. I found a Greek guy who spoke Gaelic, a German who was a complete farmer in the west of Ireland. I found a Finnish cartoonist. And I just loved the accents and the voices and loved the fact that you could get this primary connection with people and you just crafted it, and suddenly I was the medium for letting other people in on these people. So I think we had a very good trainer who loved nature. He was a sailor. And so he used to bring in sound into his work. And so he taught me how to use sound for imaginative purposes. And then when I came to Australia, I learned a lot at the social history unit with people like Tim Bowden, who sadly has just passed away. And they were great at transforming oral history with a bit of craft and panache into really compelling documentary. And I just got tapped on the shoulder and asked to do amazing stories like the history of the Snowy Mountain scheme. And it took off from there.
So somehow you found it and it found you?
Yeah, I always felt comfortable with audio. I think also storytelling is very much part of the Irish DNA. I mean, even if you go into a bank in Ireland, I notice it today when I go home, the teller will start engaging you with something and the queue is leaning in, and it's just natural. It's part of what we do.
And so was that how you built your expertise, through moving from project to project?
Very much so. Also listening a lot. So Radio National was a fabulous source in those days. It had loads of crafted audio slots. It had the history stuff. It had documentaries like Background Briefing. It had the more arty Radio Eye, which I managed to get into once. And I had the luxury then of a sound engineer who accompanied me out to this very poor housing estate in Western Sydney, Claymore, where there were something like 65 Samoan chieftains in residence, and there was a lot of crime, and the story was about how that crime got ameliorated by bringing in the cultural aspect of the Samoans. So we were able to record these Samoan choirs, just amazing harmonies, and that was really fabulous, but that wasn't my normal thing. Usually I was doing documentaries for Radio National. So yeah, I just learned by watching listening to other people's work. And then when you got into studio, you had an executive producer, fabulous people like Claudia Taranto, whose ears, Michelle Rayner, who would give you fairly trenchant feedback, which was very valuable.
Well, since the radio days, and still, of course, we have had this emergence of this kind of, younger sibling, I guess, of radio in the form of podcasting. And I guess if you define it really broadly, you could say podcasting is just an audio file delivered by an RSS feed. And it's just this incredibly broad category now. How do you sort of make sense of something that is as broad as podcasting?
Well, I think 80%, I saw a figure once, 80% of what we call podcasts, what's out there, are chatcasts. So interview, chat, conversation format. So basically mainly talk. And that can range from the most amateurish kind of stuff with hobbyists and indies through to quite sophisticated podcasts like The Rest is History, where you have two historians with great chemistry and great expertise who are, tackling big topics and have become the big hit of the last couple of years. But in the other 20%, I like some of that stuff, but my main interest is in the crafted narrative documentary limited series form, which is part of that other 20%, which would include, there's the serialized nonfiction that I do, and then there's fiction, which is really burgeoning as well. And then there's all this kind of interesting stuff that's very niche, which might be personal essays, it might be monologue, it might be arty, experimental indie stuff, which podcasting can accommodate, and I love that. And I also love the fact that the guy who essentially invented the RSS feed, Dave Weiner, who's still blogging away, he's an ex-Harvard genius, when he made the RSS feed, deliberately made it open and didn't patent it, didn't wall it off. He could have made a fortune, but I actually asked him about this, and I have an email from him to this effect, confirming this, that he didn't want to make money. At the time, amazingly, he said, I had enough money. I wasn't interested. I was much more interested in creating a new medium where people could be creative and essentially having it be open access. So I love that even though we're losing that with paywalled product, we still have that as the essential defining characteristic for me of what a podcast is. It's available online, open access.
And it really did kind of metaphorically sort of throw the doors open for spoken word audio, didn't it? So that you have this kind of space where experimentation is possible in a way that it's not in broadcast spaces in the same way.
Look, it was revolutionary in the sense that there are no gatekeepers in podcasting. And okay, it's a tired cliche that anyone with a laptop or even a phone and an idea can essentially make a podcast. And yes, they can, but they can make very bad podcasts and nobody might listen to them. There's that. I mean, we know there's 4 or 5 million podcasts out there, but very few of them persist. A lot of them don't go past 2 or 3 episodes. I believe 40% of them die in the first 3 episodes because they're more challenging than people think. But on the other hand, it is hugely different in so many ways that we don't operate within a broadcast regulatory system in podcasting. So first of all, it means that theoretically anybody can be a maker, can be a producer. And also there's no restraint on either content or form. So in the old days, as you know, we had to work to the broadcast clock. Whatever I had to say about the Snowy had to be constrained into 6 by 28 minute episodes, no matter that I had brilliant material on the cutting room floor. But these days, if I were making something about the Snowy, I could go, and I would go, for 18 episodes. And the other difference is I'd bring myself into it much more. So I was always the invisible mediator in those documentaries because that was the thinking at the time. But nowadays, we really value that parasocial relationship between the host and the listener. And that's playing out even in narrative documentaries, where it seems to work much better if the host does a bit of self-disclosure. It might be just something like, whatever their favourite type of cheese is. Even Michael Barbaro on The Daily used to drop in his penchant for red wine or whatever it was, and it just humanises people and makes us feel a bit more engaged. So I like that about podcasting. But on the other hand, there are some small kind of drawbacks. I mean, one is discoverability. You don't have the huge promotional support and visibility of the institution that you might have been tagged with. And you don't have access to things like their music library. So, for instance, when I made a series about the women in the Vietnam War, I could use the whole palette of 60s music, Rolling Stones, everybody. But I can't, Creedence Clearwater. They were really part of the feel of the era, but you can't do that if you're out there in podcast land. So there are constraints in other ways. It's not completely open slather.
And I think accidental discovery is that other thing that's much harder to come by in podcasting. It's not that you sort of step into the car and a thing is on the radio and you think, oh, what's that thing? It's much harder to encounter podcasts.
Well, you can flip that both ways. So, yes, I love the serendipitous factor in radio. The fact that, you'd switch it on and suddenly you'd find out something you didn't know you needed to know, or you'd get sucked into something. This is much more self-curated podcasting. For the maker, that also has benefits because it means you've got a highly motivated listener. You've got somebody you can kind of assume if they're listening, they're going to stay with me for half the first ep at least. And
start at the beginning.
Yeah. So I think, in one sense, yes, it's putting us back into silos. and podcasts spread via social media recs and networks and communities, and you don't get that broad listenership that you did have. On the other hand, you as the podcast host, you don't have to come after some stiff BBC type voice that might have lost you half your listeners because they're punks or something. You know, you can actually go straight into the audience you want to cultivate, and you can be as niche as you want. You just need a good idea and something that you know people care about.
I don't know where you think we're up to. I think I've sort of seen discussions that say we're maybe in the third wave of podcasting now, that first decade where it was really, pretty much an internet backwater, the arrival of Serial, and then the big kind of tech giant takeovers that started in 2019, perhaps as this kind of third wave. And I think last year was a particularly dramatic year where a lot of that money crashed back out of the podcasting space or reconfigured into more of those sort of chatcast models that we've talked a little bit about. How do you measure podcasting's health now in late 2024?
Look, I'm an optimist and I passionately believe in the power of audio. I'm one of those people that thinks it does help build empathy and connection. And yes, the forces of the dark forces can harness that factor too. But I still believe that podcasting will continue to thrive. I think that what happened with the big crash of the Spotify et al. Was just down to greed. They thought that they could scale up the Joe Rogan type stuff and find other Joe Rogan type things. And they got rid of the one good documentary making arm they had, which was Gimlet, and which was also wildly overpriced when they bought it anyway. So I think that was a necessary kind of correction. And I'm not glad that people lost their jobs, of course, but I'm glad that sort of hubris, if you like, has gone out of the field. I think it is possible to monetize podcasts. Certainly the hardest one to get funding for is the premium narrative documentary limited run series, the sort of investigative journalism stuff I do with others, because it takes huge time and enormous skills. And so when you've got people that are highly skilled and have to work on something for a long time, like we took 3 years working on The Greatest Menace, obviously you have to find quite a bit of money. And we're looking at a ballpark figure per hour of crafted audio storytelling of around $40,000 to $50,000. And that was in US dollars. And I consulted with a few other people about that and kind of thought, yeah, that's where it's at. But that is kind of wishful thinking. Most of us have to settle for quite a lot less than that, but that's what you're looking at. But that is still absolute peanuts compared to making these kind of things for television. And the reason I'm optimistic as well is that I see colleagues, people like Richard Baker from The Age. I started working with him back in 2016 on Phoebe's Fall, and The Age did 2 or 3 more podcasts, all of which won awards, etc., investigative podcasts he was hosting. He quit his job at The Age about a year ago and has started his own podcast production company, and it's going gangbusters. He's got the Pong Su podcast being turned into TV. He's employing people and he's co-proing stuff with Listener. So he's got one on about the wheat scandal in Iraq at the moment called Baghdad Nights. And he's doing chat things, he's doing light entertainment as well as deep investigative stuff for which he's won the highest Walkley Awards, etc. So if people like Richard will walk away from, a secure job in a premium newspaper to go solo, I think that says a lot about where podcasting is headed.
Good. I like optimism. Optimism is good. And you mentioned The Greatest Menace. I want to talk about some of your work a bit. Tell me about that project in particular and your role in it.
So The Greatest Menace is an 8-part podcast on Audible, though it's free, it's open access, which exposes a gay prison that was set up by the government and operated in New South Wales in Australia for about 30 years or so. And the title, The Greatest Menace, comes from the Commissioner of Police at the time, who called homosexuality the greatest menace facing Australia at the time. And it was, of course, illegal. So what they did was, the government, the New South Wales government, they basically arrested any men they could find who were known homosexuals. They could be in private consenting relationships. That didn't matter. They would go to people's apartments, but mostly they tried to find people in public beats like toilets, which is where people had to meet because there were no licensed gay bars or anything. And if they were found either responding to seduction attempts by covert policemen or whatever, they would be charged and could be sentenced for, some of them went for 1 year to 5 years. The maximum was up to 14 years. And hundreds of people were sentenced and sent to this prison in rural Australia, where they became the subjects of investigation by a team led by a professor of psychiatry at the Uni of Sydney to try and cure homosexuality. So the funny thing about it was that almost nobody had heard of it.
Like, it's just shocking, even when you describe it. Like, it's almost unfathomable because it's not too distant past either.
No, it ran until homosexuality was decriminalised in 1984, and then it was used for other purposes. The prison was repurposed. But even a gay former High Court judge, Michael Kirby, who we interview in the series, didn't know about it when we asked him about it. And he spent his early years in his profession, in his career, terrified of being outed and afraid to come out because he said quite flatly he would not have had the career options, the huge success, being part of the United Nations, investigations and all kinds of things, had he been openly gay. So it was a terrible time, and people suffered horribly as a result. And Patrick Abboud is the host. He's a Palestinian Lebanese Australian who's gay, and he's a kind of face of the Pride movement here. He's a well-known TV personality. He teamed up with a colleague who's a film documentary maker, Simon Koenig, and they'd never made a podcast before. And the reason they went for the podcast form is because they really wanted to go in deep. And like TV, as he said to me, you cannot do a 4-hour, 5-hour, 6-hour interview in TV. You just, the EP goes mad. You can't handle that kind of material. Whereas it's actually manageable economically and in terms of, editing and craft to do it in audio. And you can get really deep material when you go like that. Plus, audio is conducive to this kind of long-form interviewing because people feel far less self-conscious and they're more inclined to open up and be revelatory in their interviews. They're not worried about what they're wearing. And that's another reason I like audio, because it's just very liberating in so many ways. And it does promote intimacy and authenticity, which are the big flagship characteristics of podcasting. So they brought me in. The reason they brought me in was because I had taught Pat audio storytelling many moons ago at SBS, and we'd gotten on well. And he remembers I told him there were no rules, and he really liked that. Well, there are a few rules. I think we were doing a creative exercise. But anyway, he knew that audio was different, and he wanted somebody who could help with the script, with the narrative structure, and most of all, with optimal storytelling through sound. So basically what I did with those three things, I taught them to think through their ears and to adjust to the timing difference in audio, and the tone and the tempo are different. So it's much less shouty than television. I cringe when I hear TV people doing podcasts and they're saying, and we're there and the Snowy Mountains campers and somebody died, and they're shouting in your ear. And that's just squandering the whole intimacy of the medium. So it took a while for everybody to find their feet, but we really gelled as a team, and it taught me the joy of collaboration, that when you have a good team and you're all on the same page, that sort of synergy, that the team is greater than the sum of its parts, was remarkable. And it wasn't just us three, even though we worked really closely for 2 years. They'd done a year's work before they brought me in. But afterwards, when we got the sound design people involved, we had kind of set such a high bar, both artistically, creatively, editorially, and in terms of rigor, that, we were really committed to this podcast. We were really dedicated. We all believed in it. And I think that percolated on to the people at Unison who took a while to adjust. Again, they were coming in too heavy. It was too busy. The sound design, the worldizing that they call it. But they did take it down a notch, which allows the listener to be the co-creator and to develop that intimacy and to unleash the imagination. And that's the way the best podcast storytelling works.
And as you mentioned before, we also get Patrick's story woven through the narrative as well, don't we?
Well, that was actually a contribution I made on the very first day. We have a picture of us doing the script breakdown with our little coloured Post-it notes, and we've got green for the interview talent, who are the core of most podcast narratives. Then we have the pink story beats, the dark pink, and we have orange for archive, and we have yellow for dramatizations when you need to voice an email or something like that, just for texture. But Pat had mentioned a couple of things on that first day about the struggle he was facing navigating his own coming out with his mother, with his parents, because being conservative, Arab, Australians, I mean, they're not Muslim, but they were, in their religion, they were Christian Maronite, but that was against homosexuality. Basically, that was the teaching. And his mother was really struggling, trying to understand and accept Pat's identity. So I said to him, would you be comfortable if we could make this a beat of each episode? Because I really think that this would be a beautiful counterpoint to zoom into the micro story, the personal story, and it would stop us getting lost in the weeds of the historical investigation, which feels quite distant, but only if you're comfortable. And look, he took some persuading because he thought it might come across as self-indulgent, but Simon and I kept, putting stuff in, and when he'd listen, we'd say, no, it's great. It's really affecting. And his mother did vacillate along the way. And then by the end, spoiler, she just comes on side with this beautiful letter, and it's really, really emotional and gorgeous.
It really does kind of connect the past and the present, in the sense that on the one hand, they feel like very distant and foreign events to be happening, and then we see them in a different way played out in a very contemporary life, don't we?
Absolutely. And I mean, as part of the podcast, we got people's records expunged, and there's a very moving bonus episode.
I love that bonus episode. I love it also. It's one of my favourite parts of the podcast.
It is. It's a beautiful demonstration of just the power of voice. That man, David, who was 86, and he heard about the podcast, and he contacted Pat, and we got in touch, and he had been imprisoned for a year just for making eye contact with a cop who was trying to entrap gay men. And his family disowned him after that, and he ran away to the US. But he couldn't even get permanent residency in the US because he had a criminal record. And he hadn't come out. And he was 86. And we have this beautiful scene that I know I've played you and your students. And, he opens the letter and starts to read that Department of Justice is apologising for the treatment and the harm and the distress, and they've expunged his record. And it's just the most moving moment.
Extraordinary, yeah.
It is really beautiful. But that was also interesting because we were doing that on Australia Day as a follow-up. And what happened was the normal guy that we had doing the sound design, the great guy, was off, being a public holiday. And they had some random person in the company. And the first pass at the music, which nearly got to air, nearly got online, was this awful schmaltzy hallmark. He literally started the violins, and it drowned out the sound of David actually sobbing. You couldn't hear his actual emotion because of this faux manufactured emotion, this manipulative music. And we were like horrified. We nearly went on strike. We said, get that out, strip it out. And then we got our guy back and he put in this beautiful, just gentle, we have nothing for about the first 2 minutes. And then we gradually have this pulsing music that just supports his growing joy as he realises that he's now free to be himself for the first time at the age of 86.
Yeah, I mean, if you've not listened to The Greatest Menace, it is an extraordinary listen. And there's a clip that I want us to play as well. But before we do that, I just want to recap, because all of those ingredients that you're talking about and the duration, there's so much kind of nuance and touch and complexity that you're wrestling with. I don't even know how you get your head around that volume of work with so many elements. feels like a lot.
It is, and that's the thing. I mean, I see it as an art form. I see it as what we do as a hybrid of art and journalism, but it's definitely an artistic form. And I suppose this has become my mission, to make people, whether it's the Australia Council for the Arts or the Australian Research Council or in an academic sense or whatever, or media organisations, to understand that because podcasts might sound natural and effortless, does not mean they are easy to make. It's actually a huge skill. I call it the invisible art of audio storytelling. And it's flown completely under the radar because people appreciate film and they know, oh yeah, Wes Anderson, he does this kind of stuff, or, the Coen brothers or Almodovar or whatever it is. They all have styles that are auteurs, recognisable and acclaimed. But there's an actual aspect of that to making good narrative podcasts. I mean, there are brilliant writers like heavyweight Jonathan Goldstein, fabulous writer for podcasts. And it's not easy to do. You have to have a real appreciation of and understanding of the audio medium. And you have to have a kind of trust in the alchemy of the mix, which is that ineffable thing that we cannot understand, that we love, that happens in studio when you choreograph sound and you place some kind of a seagull's call just before somebody starts talking. And suddenly in the listener's mind, it's evoking, might be the wild Atlantic seascape for somebody, it might be a summer holiday for somebody else, but sound is subjective. And so that is the beauty of it, that when you don't give them a prescribed image, as in video, where you're just sort of made to be a passive recipient of a message, your mind is free to wander. And so it sticks much more, the storytelling, because you bring, like with a good novel, you bring your own lived experience to it, your own interpretation, your own susceptibilities and sensibilities. And that's what I'm always trying to tap into. I'm trying to leave things kind of loose and metaphorical, but without losing sight of structure at the same time.
Yeah, it's so exciting to hear it talked about. And I mean, I think that's also been one of the things that's been missing, right? Because those filmmakers, those auteurs, they talk about their craft and with reverence. And I think there's been a bit of a tradition in radio, certainly, hopefully less so in podcasting now, of kind of dismissing what we do to some extent and going, oh, it's just talk. It's just talk. And of course, it is so much more than that. And we have a clip from The Greatest Menace. Can you set that up for us?
So we interviewed a lot of people. We had about 102 hours of interview and 24 hours of actuality to reduce to about a 6-hour series. And one of the people that we found kind of randomly at first was a local guy. The town, spoiler, was Cooma, which is in the Snowy Mountains in New South Wales. And he was a local there who had been a volunteer with a church group visiting the jail in the 90s. So he's an important eyewitness to us, for us. His name is Brian Curzon. And he had been kind of off in some of his comments before. He'd made some really horrible kind of comments about homosexuality and whatever. But it was only in the course of this interview that something unfolded that was quite challenging for Pat. So what you perhaps could listen for in this clip is, first of all, the live interview, the interview as it unfolds, where this man makes an offensive assertion about homosexuality and what he interprets it as being, and how Pat comports himself. You can feel him tensing. But we also then regain agency by writing around that back in studio. So some of it is just explainer stuff that Pat puts in, but some of it is actually taking back control of the narrative. And he actually says that. Pat says something about it. He cuts him off. And then the other element that's there is the music. Where does it come in? It's beautiful tonally. It's really apt. And it also is beautifully placed. It just sort of scaffolds and amplifies the growing kind of horror that the listener is feeling as they realise what he's saying. But the last thing is Pat's meta commentary and the debrief in the car, which is brilliant, which was Simon sticking the mic in and saying, how are you feeling now? And we bring all that together in this clip.
Yeah. Okay. Just listen.
If you were two homosexuals, right? Now, It goes all against my Christian values, right? But who am I to judge? As long as you keep it to yourself. Don't go out and display it and hold hands in bloody Oxford Street, right?
Oxford Street in Sydney being where one of the biggest gay pride events in the world happens, which I hosted on TV for years.
Would I be wrong in saying that you are a homosexual?
I am.
Right.
Do you think I chose to be homosexual?
Yes.
And what might have made me make that choice?
I'd have to know more about you. Are you the male or the female in the relationship?
I don't really know how to answer that question, to be honest. I'm a man, and my partner's a man. He's also a gay man. We're both men.
I'm not against homosexuality. If you love one another, that's between you and God. That's my attitude. But don't touch kids. Is there a difference between a homosexual and a pedophile?
So you think there's no difference between a homosexual and a pedophile?
They're very close. I think that they jumped the gap. They jumped the barrier.
I'm not sure what you mean.
If you let me finish.
I'm not going to let him finish. Just before we walk out the door, Brian asks to give me a hug. Because of COVID restrictions, I politely decline.
Do you know why I wanted to hug you?
Why?
A hug says, I like you.
What the fuck was that? Oh my god. I don't think I've ever been so offended, amused, and shocked at the same time.
Yeah, that's it really rocks you back on your heels, doesn't it?
It does, because you can feel the sneery, sort of venomous vituperativeness of this man, and he's likening homosexuality to pedophilia. He basically is suggesting that they're the same thing, which was actually a really thorny issue because legally there had been a conflation around those two issues. And once the prison was closed down in 1984 after homosexuality was decriminalised, the government actually made it a place for sex offenders, for pedophiles. So in the public mind, these things were conflated already, and this was really insidious. But we used that clip and placed it in order to address that head on in the script.
Tell us the outcome. There's not been a single outcome of that podcast, but there's been a very significant outcome from it, which I'm sure you couldn't have even hoped for when you started making it.
Yeah, we've had a lot of real-world impact, but perhaps the highest point was just in June when the Premier in New South Wales led an apology in the Parliament to those who had been criminalised for being gay. And it was on the anniversary of the 40th repeal of that law. But he invited us, Pat, me, Simon, plus some of our main contributors, Jackie Grant, a trans woman who now lives in New Zealand, Terry and John, a couple who've been married for 50 years, who are very much part of our story, and others to be in the gallery when they made that apology. And they mentioned The Greatest Menace in Parliament. And also, the Sydney Morning Herald referred to it as having been the trigger that really put pressure on the Premier, or spurred him on, that was the word, spurred him on to make this apology. So we feel that this was really healing for a lot of the people who were just horribly hard done by, and whose lives were changed, not irrevocably in some cases, because Jackie, for instance, is very much a survivor and a remarkable woman who went on to live in New Zealand, where she fostered 72 children, among other things like running a zoo, and now has a sock museum. So great characters. But we also, with the help of Equality Australia, got people's records expunged so that they could get that metaphorical and very real change. And I think it just it's important to set the record straight about hidden history of marginalised people. And all of that has been recognised in the sense that we have won a lot of awards both in Australia and overseas, up against all kinds of people in New York, in the UK. We've beaten those other stories, which means a lot to us because we put our heart and soul into it. And the money ran out a long time before we stopped working on it.
As it does, as you say, there's this kind of challenge in getting people to actually pay for this kind of work. I want to pivot to another one of your projects now, quite a different one, and I guess kind of bringing your academic expertise here. One of the things that has emerged in the Academy in recent decades, probably it's fair to say, is a recognition of other forms of knowledge making, and podcasting has moved into that space. There's a project that you did called The Heart of Artness, which was funded by the Australian Research Council, so very much considered a piece of research as well as a podcast in the conventional sense that we might know them to be. Can you tell us about that project?
Yeah, so this podcast started as a study, an investigation, a multidisciplinary research project that involved an art historian, Ian McLean, who's a professor of contemporary art down at Uni of Melbourne, just about to retire. Margot Neal, then the head of Indigenous Studies at the National Museum of Australia, and myself as an oral historian and podcast producer, narrative podcast producer. And we conceived it way back in 2013-14. It was actually after Ian heard me giving an oral history seminar at Uni of Wollongong, and he realised, the missing element in all his work as an art historian were the actual voices of Aboriginal artists, that he, like other white scholars, anthropologists, critics, were writing about these artists, but nobody had ever actually included their perspective, certainly not firsthand. They might have observed them, but not actually interviewed them. So he realised we can put these voices front and centre of this project, which was really to not just investigate the Aboriginal artists' process, but also their relationship with white collaborators who were very important to the marketing and management and business end of the art industry and had not been documented. So that was the premise of the project. When we applied, I went back and looked at the Discovery application. The serial hadn't happened, so we weren't talking about the word podcast, but we were talking about audio storytelling and radio documentary. We actually did an ABC radio documentary as well as part of it. It happened between 2015 and 18. That was a 3-year project. And I went to amazing places, remote communities in Northeast Arnhem, in Yuendamu, which is in Central Australia, and also an urban collective in Brisbane, and recorded interviews with about 35 artists. And that was the raw material for what became a podcast series, as well as the Radio National documentary, Heart of Artness is the podcast series. And it was what we now call a non-traditional research outcome, NTRO, which is increasingly recognised in Australia and also in the UK, less so in Europe and the US, but it's coming. And we argued that the definition of research, obviously, is the creation of new knowledge. We were creating new knowledge by this primary research that was managing to give voice to these Aboriginal Indigenous artists, but excavating, if you like, their views and then synthesising that new knowledge in an aesthetic that would heighten its cognition, its ability to be engaged with and to be appreciated by a bigger public. So it was all those elements together, the collection of primary material and then the synthesis into a recorded, crafted aesthetic that followed certain conventions of audio storytelling that I and others have written about and theorised, and there's an increasing body of theory on this work now. And the Australian Research Council really went with it, especially after one episode, and we have a clip that we can play from this episode. One episode won gold at New York festivals in the arts and culture category, which was fabulous for us because it meant for us a form of peer review. That, you know, that's just really evaluating it as an artifact, as an audio story artifact, and among all the other international offerings, and it won gold. And it tells the story of, among other things, a terrible massacre that happened in 1911 in this place, about 3 hours out from the town of Nullinboy. And I was taken there by Garawan, who's an elder artist who comes from there. And the funny thing is, we write about this in Liminalities Journal. We write cross-cultural frontiers, hearing Australian Aboriginal voices through podcast. I've got a multimedia article, the three of us wrote it. But the only reason we had Garawan and that all this happened, as we point out in the article, was that we spotted him across the aisle in Woolies when we were buying sausages to take out to this community, because you don't go out there empty-handed because it's far away. And he needed a lift. And on the way out, we ran out of things to say. And there was something about the landscape and the red dirt. And, you know, this man doesn't speak much, and English is about his fourth language, that compelled me to start talking, maybe gibbering even, about some of my mythology stories from Ireland. And there's a beautiful story about the salmon of knowledge that I've kind of made my kids learn as well, because I love it. And this salmon goes into this pool, and whoever catches him will be the leader of the warriors for the years to come. And this boy gets it by accident, and it's a fabulous story. And Carwin was listening, and he said, I know that story. I know that salmon fellow. And then when we got to the waterhole, he said, my water goanna, he's like your salmon. Same thing, same. And it was like that was the moment of connection. And then he said, come, sit, I'll tell you about the gapan, which is the word for ochre. And it was like all my plans, you know, Lavalier mics, everything perfect. There were 3 people, and he just said, sit, and it was now. I was being told he was going to talk, and it was now. And so all I could do was banish everybody else and say, just get away for an hour, give me this hour, and go with my one mic. And you can hear, even in this short clip, you can hear them starting to speak Yolnumata, which is the language, which I felt was really important. And then they call massacre Makassar, which is partly because English is not the first language, and partly because there is that Makassan tradition up there, I think, the Indonesian traders that came long ago. But it's just very moving to be taken, to know you're on the site and they're looking at the very spot where some of their ancestors, 32 people, were killed just randomly on a so-called punitive expedition. As it turned out, quite erroneously, they had been accused of killing a white man who turned up 2 weeks after all these people had been killed. But it's just a tiny moment. But even just hearing the fly buzzing and the birds, I think, is beautiful, and it really evokes the scene. Let's have a listen.
This is the place where the European or the Gangan Makassa.
Yinamala's great-grandfather arrived back from a trip and stumbled on the victims.
When he got there and he see all the people, lying down, and he only recognized the armbands, and then he knew that these people was killed.
And their body, their bones, their flesh, laying down the river.
And my uncles, my fathers, they decided to put the plaque.
Could you read it for us, Yinamala?
In memory of the Broadboy people, the Gangan Makassa.
I can tell you I wouldn't have been listening so quietly to that interview if I had known at the time that there were crocs in that river.
It does. When you're in the top end, it does shape your behaviour, doesn't it? It's beautiful to hear that, to hear location, to hear country in tape as well, and I think that's one of the things it really evokes. I, like I'm sure you do, get a lot of researchers approaching me and wanting to make podcasts as a way of sharing knowledge, perhaps making new knowledge as well. What is your advice to your fellow academics when they approach you and ask that question? I know what mine is, but I'm interested to hear what yours is.
Well, I think just that, if they could just take a moment to think about the fact that audio is different, distinct, and that you have to know its strengths and its weaknesses to get the best out of it. So they're not just talk. All conversations that happen, in corridors or living rooms are not innately riveting. you need to have if you've got somebody, if you're doing a two-parter sort of chatcast thing, you need to have chemistry. You need to find somebody with whom you have a relationship, whether it's a sparring type relationship or whether it's a supportive type relationship. You need to click. You need to be able to jibe each other a little and prod and maybe go deeper or whatever. You need to have some kind of structure before you go into the studio. So bullet points at least of what you're going to talk about, but do not bring in a written script and read it out, because we can always tell, and it is very off-putting and boring, and it just deadens everything. Plus, most people who are new to this don't know the basics, Audio 101, that you use conversational writing and you use contractions. So you don't say do not, you say don't, and all of that stuff. Because the reason, if you don't do that, you sound stilted and formal, and you basically sabotage the whole thing you're after, which is naturalness, intimacy, just sounding like it's spontaneous. So you have to actually, it's kind of performed spontaneity, and it's a skill. It's hard to do. So the other thing is, once you have done your first so-called episode, I'm trying not to be mean here, remember, editing is your friend.
Hard truths, Siobhan, hard truths. We're going to lay it on the line here.
Editing is really important. Very few of us emit, fully formed, beautiful sentences, and often we ramble and are repetitive, and that is not fun for the listener. So if you can hone it and distill it, do. Maybe have a sort of a rough time frame and cut it back to that. Also, do not ramble for 9 minutes at the beginning before you get into your topic. Rambling, banter for 2 or 3 minutes is great. 9, 12 minutes, I've heard, is just awful. Think of sound itself. It's not hard. Most people have smartphones now. I listened to one podcast by 2 academics who I think were pediatric psychologists or something. They had written a journal article, they were discussing it, about infant vocalizations. And for 45 earnest minutes, they struggled to describe how a baby sounds like when it's hungry or tired or cold or happy. And I just thought, why didn't you just play a baby? Why didn't you just find a baby and give us a gurgling baby, a crying sound of a hungry baby, and then we would have got it in 5 seconds, and then you could talk about it. But clearly they were just so used to reading, to doing journal articles. The most abominable podcast that I've probably ever listened to was one of those auto reads of a journal article, and it was on bariatric surgery. So somebody was having their stomach stapled against overeating or whatever. And there was all this N equals this, a statistical analysis of the thing. It was like some kind of sophisticated torture, having to listen to this, which I did for research purposes. I will never do again. But even small things, there was a James Joyce podcast that I stumbled on. I love James Joyce because I'm from Dublin and grew up where he opens Ulysses and all the rest of it. And there was this man mumbling into his pillow. That's the only way I can describe it. He might have known a lot of stuff, but I couldn't discern it because he was just, it was like somebody waking up at 3 a.m. and just mumbling. And that was not sexy or fun, contrary to what he might have imagined. It was just, impossible to hear, inaudible mutterings and ramblings. So better to have a producer who can keep a weather eye on what's going on, even if that producer is one of our young grad students. They're great. Just doesn't have to have expertise in your topic, but they can be your litmus test. And also have some kind of a theme around it that you top and tail it with. And maybe think about how to put carve it up so that you get little bits, that it's not just one big slice of what I once called of somebody's effort, audio toilet roll.
Well, that is harsh, but I like it. So while we're on a roll, that's for our researchers and our academic colleagues. What about for students? Because, of course, we've got lots of students dabbling in this, and you are very experienced with student work. Is there a way you can boil down the essence of typically what you hear going wrong in student work and the thing that you would want them to take away and try and get right?
Look, I've heard some lovely student work, and it depends. Again, we're talking oranges and lemons here, because a group podcast, which is often an assignment, I've taught a lot of that, and we would have maybe in a group of 4, 2 people would become the hosts. One would be the tech producer, one would be the exec producer, editorial. So they're playing to their strengths, and usually sometimes I will nudge people towards partnerships if I think that A would complement B. But essentially, the extroverts put their hand up to be the hosts. And so it generally does tend to work out. What I like is when people go against type. And I've heard some beautiful first-person audio essay storytelling type podcasts that are just reflective pieces, personal storytelling that people have done. About one girl I remember talked about, coming home at night from the train station and imagining footsteps behind her. And it was essentially a reflection on fear of assault and her identity and her sense of wanting to be independent. And it was beautiful and very evocative. And you only need to put in sounds like footsteps and maybe a distant train or something like that. And you're really inside somebody's head. And it was very valid. To me, that was really very good audio storytelling. So that's light years away from the laughing sort of entertainment chatcast where they're discussing the latest celebrity scandal or something. So it's hard to give a specific answer. I suppose again it all comes down to that thing of think through your ears. So always look for sound that you can actually gather, even if it's just in the kitchen. One guy did a really funny piece about eggs. Eggs used to disgust him, and he recorded people cooking eggs in all these different ways and how revolted he was by each type of thing. And it was just very funny. It was, I forget the feature. I think he was trying to, the theme of the show was disgust, and that was his thing. And it was just a very light-hearted way, but it was authentic and it worked. And a lot of it was to do with those sounds that he got. So it doesn't have to be a big, heavy investigation. It doesn't have to be, something to do with politics or whatever. It can be a really small moment. Those moments work beautifully for podcasts. And I think if students could work with that, I know that it takes confidence to put yourself out there. But go with the intimacy of the medium. Imagine that you're only going to tell 10 people about this, and they're people you trust who will probably want to listen and like it, and then do what you want to do for them.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And don't make a chumcast unless it's going to be really good. There's a lot of those. Just before we let you go, I want to touch on podcasting as an academic field, because I know that's another area where you've done a lot of work to develop the scholarship in the space as well. Where is that at the moment?
Well, as you would know, Helen, we have just come back from a podcast roundtable, which was an official pre-conference of the IAMCR, the International Association of Media Communications Research, which is one of the 2 biggest international organizations around. And it's great that they are actually taking us podcast studies scholars so seriously that we were able to be validated, to be, included. We were one of only about 10 pre-conferences. So that happened in June this year, and I co-convened it with Mia Lindgren, and we deliberately, and Lee Redfern and Dylan Bird were also organising. But I really was pleased that we were able to distill it down to 18 scholars. We didn't want it to be like a conference. We had people from 5 continents, but we wanted people to be able to spend a day getting past those 15-minute presentations that you do at conferences. You travel 3,000 miles and then you get 12 minutes or something. We wanted really good conversations to happen so we could break down barriers and figure out what needs to be researched, how do we do it, what sort of networks can we build. And at the end of the day, it was so wonderful. We had people from China, from India, from the US, from Europe, from Australia. And at different stages, we had a lot of PhD candidates right through to very senior scholars. And we managed to put up this sort of post-it, what would you call it? Just a sort of
all sorts of
constellation.
Like a lovely way to describe it. Yeah.
And I have just distilled those into a report that will be published shortly. So you're getting this hot off the press. So some of the themes that emerged as of interest to researchers for the future: intimacy in podcasts. To research this with sub-themes from how to investigate authenticity and trust to what somebody termed I epistemology, which is analysing the first person / host, who is so central to the podcast form. Podcast journalism and its political democratic implications, the need for fact-checking, and applications in areas such as climate change, how podcasting, what it can bring to these crucial topics in journalism. Then we move to podcast format and content analysis. And here we have interest in feminist / activist alternative podcasts, health and public diplomacy podcasts in China, critical analysis of podcast formats from banter to narrative. One of the Indian scholars, I think brilliantly, suggested we need to study the use of banter, particularly in the Empire podcast she was referencing with William Dalrymple and his co-host, Anita, I forget her surname. But she's a journalist, he's a historian, and they're very yin and yang, and it annoys a lot of people, but it actually works for other people. I'm kind of on the shelf. I love the podcast. But I think it's really important to analyse something as seemingly trite as banter, because it's actually a way that you captivate listeners and build a loyalty among audiences. People love it. People have done studies on it already. And then the final one that I'll mention is, of course, looking at audience / consumption and impact. So investigating the business model, develop an impact framework, I think is really important. Examine the technology, regulation and policy, and try and establish a global evaluation model and a kind of podcast atlas, sort of global playlist. So I think that's enough to be going on with.
No shortage of work there, which is always reassuring. It's good to have work to do. I think there are some really great listening examples to take out of this conversation, the greatest menace, of course, being one, Heart of Artness. To finish up, is there a recommendation? Is there something else on your podcast app that you're listening to that we should really be listening to as well?
Yeah, there's a few. But one that really surprised me is what might be termed, and I would not have really expected to like this kind of podcast, what might be termed a branded podcast. So this was commissioned by the Australian National Gallery. And you could see it as, oh, this is just PR for the gallery. It's in connection with the Gauguin exhibition that's going on at the moment. But they commissioned an independent agency, Audiocraft, to make a podcast called The Gauguin Dilemma. And it really surprised me. It's much more provocative and nuanced than I expected. Frankly, I thought we would be getting the kind of cancel Gauguin narrative just, and we'd be done with one episode and bad guy, and that's it. But actually they go into surprising areas. They have a Tahitian scholar who says, yes, Tahiti was ruined by French colonialism, but we need the tourist dollar today to redress the impacts, and so cancelling Gauguin is going to do nobody any good in Tahiti. We have a Maori poet laureate who's hilariously funny and skewers the various aspects of the white colonial person, predatory type person, but also says there's no point in just cancelling people. I'm not interested in doing that because it just shuts down the debate. I want discussion. And it just goes to really surprising places. It's hosted by a Samoan Australian. It's fantastic. I really recommend it, and it's very well produced. And then for something quite different, there was an indie podcast that won at the Australian Podcast Awards last year, quite deservedly, and it's called The Lawyer, the Sniper and the New South Wales Police. Now, it's an example of two non-professional audio people, but very genuine people with big stories to tell. One, a lawyer who is a police lawyer who is... charges them with sexual assault, one of her colleagues, and the other, the sniper at the Lint Cafe siege, who talks about, the ghastly kind of onus that he was put under and how he handled it. and how they were handled basically by the police. And I can't imagine it being made in any other context than a podcast context. But the difference being that these people with genuine stories to tell, so you get this sort of unvarnished feel. You know, they're not slick storytellers, especially the sniper guy, but he's all the more real for that. But the icing on the cake is that it's beautifully produced, because this is where I see the future going, that you have people who have compelling content, but they don't know how to craft it for audio, but they team with an experienced person. So in this case, it was Gretchen Miller, who's ex-ABC. And it was beautifully done. It really was surprising. So that's two. And then a little lovely one, Come by Chance from the CBC, which is just a good example. It's from Newfoundland in Canada. Beautiful writing, story of people, switched identity, family, really real 3D people, really honours them. Low-key host in this one, but he really mediates things beautifully. And the sound design is gorgeous. And the final one, which I have to mention, if I haven't already, because it's going gangbusters and it's a perfect example of a chatcast that works, and that's The Rest is History. Two British historians who have real chemistry and jibe each other as they take you through the French Revolution or the Aztec history, or pivot to the history of soccer for the World Cup or whatever it is. But they know their onions, and they obviously troll through all the documentation beforehand and come up with speaking points, bullet points, and then talk to it as though they were just speaking off the cuff. It's really well done. The only quibble I have with that is that, you know, they're going really well in terms of millions of downloads now, but they are monetizing that, which is fine and understandable, but they are blurring the content between their content and the ads. And I'm old school enough to wish that they would just put a sting, just a little sound thing that then takes us into our ads, and we can choose whether or not to go with the ads. But they're doing story ads where it's okay to have Tom recommend a book. Tom and Dom are the two hosts. But the next thing, Tom is advising us to use a certain travel card, and it's done as a little story where in Paris we're talking about some part of the revolution, and suddenly we're being sort of bludgeoned with commercial advertising that is not clearly delineated as such. So that's my only little caveat on The Rest is History. But if for aspiring academic podcasters out there, it's a great one to look at. Should mention two books on that. Podcast or Perish is a new anthology from Bloomsbury that looks at all things podcasting as scholarly activity. And Scholarly Podcasting, Why, What, How is a really good anthology, which I think is coming as a podcast as well by Ian Cook, which interviews hundreds of podcast academics about how they do and how it works.
And your book, of course, as well.
My book.
The Power of Podcasting.
Self-promotion, which is a bit of everything. I'm kind of a victim of my own versatility here, I think, in that like some of it is how-to, where I put on my industry hat. Some of it is like sweeping history stuff. But really, mostly, somebody called it a love letter to audio storytelling, and that's what I'm really happy with.
Well, I am always delighted to hear those and read them. There is plenty to listen to, plenty to research, plenty of students to teach. Associate Professor Siobhan McHugh, thank you so much for a delightful conversation.
Thanks, Helen. Been great.